Al-Shabaab now controls the major roads leading in and out of Mogadishu, effectively isolating the capital. For the first time in decades, the terrorist organization has achieved what military analysts thought impossible, cutting off most land routes and establishing control over key infrastructure in the suburbs and approaches to the city. What makes this particularly alarming is the speed at which it happened. Between February 20th and mid-April, Al-Shabaab seized key towns, tightening the noose on Mogadishu, while over 1.4 million people have been internally displaced since February. The Somali government's response has been virtually non-existent, and the implications for the Horn of Africa are staggering. But to understand how Al-Shabaab achieved this tactical breakthrough, we first need to examine just how catastrophically Somalia's institutions have deteriorated. Somalia's catastrophic 2025 rankings. The numbers tell a devastating story. Somalia has actually gotten worse on every single measurement of state failure in recent years, and that's remarkable considering the country has held the bottom position on most global indices for over 2 decades. The question that emerges from this data is what catastrophic factors have pushed an already broken nation even further into institutional collapse. Somalia remained at the top of the 2024 Fragile States Index with a score indicating it surpassed even Afghanistan despite the Taliban takeover. The index measures 12 key indicators including demographic pressures, refugees and internally displaced persons, group grievances, human flight, uneven development, poverty, state legitimacy, public services, human rights, security apparatus, factionalized elites, and external intervention. Somalia now ranks dead last across multiple governance indices, indicating near total institutional collapse. The corruption metrics paint an even bleaker picture. Somalia scored 9 out of 100 in the 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index, the second lowest ever measured by Transparency International. The World Bank's worldwide governance indicators show Somalia scoring in the bottom percentile across all 6 dimensions of governance, including voice and accountability, political stability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. These scores indicate complete institutional breakdown at every level of government function. When compared to other failed states, Somalia's deterioration stands out dramatically. Yemen, despite its ongoing civil war, scored 25 on the Corruption Index. Haiti, experiencing gang violence and political chaos, managed a score of 17. Afghanistan under Taliban rule scored 20. Even Syria, after more than a decade of civil war, scored 14. Somalia's score represents a level of institutional collapse that exceeds every other crisis-affected nation on Earth. The poverty indicators reveal the human cost of this institutional failure. About 2/3 of Somalis live in multidimensional poverty, lacking access to food, shelter, and basic services. The World Food Program reports that 6.9 million Somalis require humanitarian assistance, representing 42% of the total population. Acute malnutrition rates have reached 23% among children under 5, exceeding emergency thresholds throughout most of the country. The breakdown of basic services has accelerated dramatically. Healthcare infrastructure exists in name only outside Mogadishu, with the World Health Organization documenting that 89% of health facilities in rural areas are either non-functional or provide only the most basic services. Educational services have collapsed entirely in regions outside government control, with UNICEF reporting that 3.7 million children are out of school. The electrical grid serves less than 12% of the population, concentrated almost entirely in Mogadishu and a few other urban centers. Water and sanitation infrastructure has deteriorated to the point where 70% of the population lacks access to safe drinking water. Law enforcement outside Mogadishu has ceased to exist in any meaningful form. The African Union Mission in Somalia reports that Somali federal police have effective presence in fewer than 30 locations nationwide. Criminal violence has surged in areas where neither government forces nor Al-Shabaab maintain control. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime documents a 340% increase in reported kidnappings, a 280% increase in armed robbery, and a 190% increase in extortion. Piracy off the Somali coast has returned to levels not seen since 2012, with 18 vessels attacked in the first half of 2025 compared to 3 in all of 2024. The democratic legitimacy crisis has reached a breaking point. Somalia has not held nationwide legislative elections since 1969, a period of 56 years that represents one of the longest democratic gaps in modern history. The current federal parliament was selected through a clan-based system in 2022 that the African Union described as fundamentally flawed. Regional elections scheduled for 2025 have been postponed indefinitely due to security concerns. Opinion polling by the Somali Public Agenda shows that only 11% of citizens trust the federal government, while 67% believe the country is heading in the wrong direction. Foreign direct investment has effectively ceased, with the UN Conference on Trade and Development reporting negative flows, meaning more foreign investment left the country than entered it. The banking sector remains underdeveloped, with only 15% of adults having access to formal financial services. Remittances from the diaspora, traditionally a crucial source of foreign currency, have declined by 23% due to increased scrutiny of money transfer operations and reduced income among diaspora communities. These metrics create a perfect storm that explains Al-Shabaab's rapid territorial gains. The absence of effective governance creates a vacuum that extremist organizations can fill. The collapse of economic opportunities drives recruitment for armed groups. The failure of security institutions removes the primary obstacle to territorial expansion. The breakdown of social services allows groups like Al-Shabaab to gain legitimacy by providing basic functions that the state cannot. The democratic legitimacy crisis means the federal government cannot rally popular support against insurgent advances. What emerges from this data is a state that has moved beyond traditional definitions of failure into complete institutional collapse. But these rankings only tell part of the story. To understand how Al-Shabaab achieved such rapid success, we need to examine exactly how much territory Somalia's federal government actually controls. The government that controls almost nothing. Government control is now limited to scattered pockets around Mogadishu and rare corridors along major roads. This represents a dramatic decline from previous years, and the trajectory suggests further contraction as various regions formalize their independence from federal authority. In late 2024, Puntland formally rejected federal oversight, deepening Somalia's fragmentation. The regional parliament in Garo voted to sever all ties with the federal government, establishing independent diplomatic relations and assuming full control over taxation, security, and resource management. Puntland's leadership cited the federal government's inability to provide basic services or security as justification for the split. The region now operates its own customs facilities, issues its own identification documents, and maintains direct relationships with international partners, including the United Nations and European Union. Puntland controls approximately 26% of Somalia's territory, making it larger than many recognized nations. Somaliland's growing international recognition has effectively removed another substantial portion of Somalia from federal control. The region has demonstrated far greater stability and governance capacity than the federal government, operating independently since 1991. Ethiopia formalized its recognition of Somaliland in March 2025, establishing full diplomatic relations and opening an embassy in Hargeisa. These developments bypass Mogadishu entirely, with international partners treating Somaliland as a sovereign entity. The region controls approximately 28% of Somalia's territory and maintains its own military, currency, and government institutions. Jubaland's move toward complete autonomy has created an active conflict zone with federal forces. The regional government in Kismayo declared its intention to assume full sovereignty in February 2025, leading to direct military confrontations with federal troops. The most significant clash occurred in March when Jubaland forces defeated a federal military convoy attempting to assert control over the Kismayo airport. The federal government lost 34 soldiers in engagement, while Jubaland forces suffered minimal casualties. Since then, Jubaland has established checkpoints along its borders with federal-controlled territory and begun collecting customs duties independently. The region controls the strategically important Kismayo port and maintains its own security forces estimated at 4,500 troops. The clan-based control systems that govern most rural areas operate completely independent of federal authority. Traditional clan elders maintain law and order through customary legal systems that predate the modern Somali state. These systems collect taxes, resolve disputes, and provide basic services without any reference to federal laws or institutions. The Rahanweyn Clan Confederation controls large portions of Bay and Bakul regions through traditional governance structures. The Dared clan maintains autonomous control over vast areas of the northeast through similar systems. The federal government has no presence in these clan-controlled territories and cannot influence their decisions or policies. The Islamic State in Somalia has carved out distinct territories in the northeast, creating another layer of fragmentation. Intelligence estimates place ISIS Somalia at around 300 to 400 fighters in remote areas of Puntland, despite the regional government's opposition. The group controls portions of the Golis Mountains and operates training camps in remote locations. The group has established its own taxation system in controlled areas and provides basic services to gain local support. Their presence creates a three-way conflict dynamic between federal forces, regional authorities, and extremist groups. The federal government's inability to collect taxes outside Mogadishu demonstrates the practical limits of its authority. Revenue collection in 2025 totaled just $287 million, with 89% coming from a capital city and Mogadishu International Airport. The government cannot collect customs duties at most border crossings, cannot tax economic activity in regional capitals, and cannot access revenue from major ports outside its control. This financial weakness reinforces the cycle of state failure, as the government cannot fund the security forces or services needed to extend its authority. Law enforcement capacity beyond Mogadishu has effectively ceased to exist. The Somali police force operates fewer than 300 officers outside the capital, concentrated in small outposts along major roads. These officers lack vehicles, communications equipment, and weapons necessary for effective policing. Most criminal cases in rural areas are handled by traditional courts or ignored entirely. The federal government cannot investigate crimes, arrest suspects, or prosecute cases in the majority of the country's territory. Health services outside Mogadishu function only through NGOs, as government clinics have effectively collapsed. The federal government maintains minimal functioning schools outside the capital, serving only a fraction of the population. The government cannot provide electricity, water, or sanitation services to rural populations. These basic functions are either provided by international aid organizations, regional governments, or clan-based systems. This fragmentation has created multiple competing power centers that claim to speak for Somalia. International partners must navigate relationships with the federal government, Puntland, Somaliland, Jubaland, and various clan leaders to conduct business in different parts of the country. The African Union maintains separate liaison offices for each major region. The United Nations operates through different local partners, depending on the territory. This complexity makes coordinated international response extremely difficult. The territorial fragmentation has created optimal conditions for Al-Shabaab's 2025 offensive. The group can exploit the gaps between different authorities, moving freely through areas where no single entity maintains control. They can play competing authorities against each other, forming temporary alliances when convenient. The absence of coordinated security responses allows Al-Shabaab to mass forces for attacks while avoiding effective retaliation. The federal government cannot call upon regional authorities for support, as those authorities view federal weakness as an opportunity to expand their own influence. Most critically, the fragmentation means that even if the federal government wanted to mount an effective response to Al-Shabaab's advance, it lacks the territorial control, resources, and legitimacy necessary to do so. The siege of Mogadishu represents not just a military defeat, but the logical conclusion of a state that has ceded authority over most of its territory to competing power centers. But understanding this institutional collapse only explains the opportunity Al-Shabaab exploited. The real question is how a ragtag militia transformed itself into the most formidable military force operating in Somalia today. Al-Shabaab's evolution into a military superpower. The answer lies in a systematic transformation that took nearly 2 decades to complete. Al-Shabaab emerged from a wreckage of the Islamic Courts Union in 2006, initially formed as the militant wing of a broader religious movement that briefly controlled Mogadishu. The group's name translates to the youth in Arabic, reflecting its origins as a collection of young fighters frustrated with Somalia's endless chaos. When Ethiopian forces invaded Somalia in 2006 to overthrow the Islamic Courts Union, Al-Shabaab became the primary resistance force. The Ethiopian occupation provided the group with a nationalist cause that transcended religious ideology, allowing them to recruit from clans and communities that opposed foreign intervention. The transformation from a loosely organized militia into a sophisticated insurgency took place between 2007 and 2012. During this period, Al-Shabaab established training camps in remote areas of southern Somalia, developed recruitment networks throughout the region, and began implementing strict Islamic law in territories under their control. The group studied insurgent tactics from conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, adapting these strategies to the specific conditions of Somalia. They developed expertise in improvised explosive devices, suicide bombings, and guerrilla warfare techniques that would become their signature methods. The 2012 Pledge of Allegiance to Al-Qaeda marked a critical turning point in Al-Shabaab's evolution. This formal alliance brought international recognition, technical expertise, and financial support that transformed the group's operational capabilities. Al-Qaeda provided training in advanced bomb-making techniques, communications security, and operational planning. The relationship also connected Al-Shabaab to a global network of extremist organizations, facilitating the exchange of fighters, weapons, and intelligence. Foreign fighters began arriving in Somalia, bringing expertise in urban warfare, complex attack planning, and international terrorism methods. Intelligence sources estimate that Al-Shabaab now commands approximately 15,000 active combatants, making it larger than many national armies. The group maintains a core of full-time fighters who receive regular salaries and undergo intensive training. Additional part-time fighters can be mobilized for specific operations, including local militia members, seasonal fighters, and sympathizers who provide logistical support. The group's weapon systems have evolved far beyond the small arms and improvised devices they once relied upon. Al-Shabaab now possesses heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and anti-aircraft weapons captured from government forces or purchased through international arms markets. They have demonstrated proficiency with vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices capable of destroying reinforced buildings. The group has also developed sophisticated improvised explosive devices that can penetrate armored vehicles and defeat electronic countermeasures. Intelligence reports indicate they have acquired night vision equipment, communications gear, and GPS systems that enable coordinated operations across multiple fronts. Al-Shabaab's command structure has evolved into a sophisticated military organization capable of coordinating complex multi-front operations. The group operates under a centralized leadership council that makes strategic decisions, while regional commanders maintain tactical autonomy within their areas of operation. This structure allows for rapid decision-making at the operational level while maintaining overall strategic coherence. The group has established specialized units for different types of operations, including intelligence gathering, bomb-making, recruitment, and media operations. Al-Shabaab funds operations through local taxation and extortion across southern Somalia. The group collects taxes from businesses, transportation, and agricultural activities in territories under their control. They operate checkpoints along major roads, collecting fees from commercial vehicles and passengers. The group has established an extensive extortion network that targets businesses throughout Somalia, including those in government-controlled areas. Smuggling operations provide another major revenue source, with Al-Shabaab facilitating the movement of goods, weapons, and people across Somalia's porous borders. The group has developed relationships with criminal networks throughout East Africa, taking percentages from various illegal activities. They have also established legitimate businesses that serve as fronts for money laundering and provide additional income streams. Al-Shabaab's recruitment strategies have expanded well beyond Somalia's borders, drawing fighters from across East Africa and beyond. The group operates recruitment networks in Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Tanzania, targeting young men facing economic hardship and political marginalization. They have also attracted fighters from Europe, North America, and the Middle East through sophisticated online propaganda campaigns. The group's recruitment materials emphasize both religious obligation and economic opportunity, offering salaries that exceed what many young men can earn in legitimate employment. Al-Shabaab collects local taxes and runs rudimentary courts, filling the service gaps left by the federal government. Their ability to provide security, resolve disputes, and maintain basic services contrasts sharply with the government's inability to function outside Mogadishu. This governance capacity has translated into popular support in some areas, making Al-Shabaab's territorial control more sustainable than simple military occupation. The military evolution that has occurred over nearly 2 decades has made Al-Shabaab more dangerous. In 2025 and at any point in their history, They combine the tactical flexibility of an insurgent group with the organizational capacity of a conventional military force. Their financial resources, weapon systems, and command structure now exceed those of the government they fight against. The group has demonstrated the ability to plan and execute complex operations while maintaining security that prevents government infiltration of their leadership structure. U.S. airstrikes supported government offensives until 2022, degrading Al-Shabaab's positions temporarily. But the group's resilience and adaptability have allowed them to recover from these setbacks and emerge stronger than before. Their current capabilities represent the culmination of years of strategic planning, organizational development, and tactical innovation that has transformed them into Somalia's most formidable military force. This transformation explains how Al-Shabaab achieved what seemed impossible just years ago. But their current success builds upon lessons learned from previous encounters with government forces, particularly from the 2022 victory that became a strategic disaster. Between August and November 2022, Somalia achieved what seemed impossible. The federal government launched the largest military operation in its modern history, driving Al-Shabaab from strategic territories across central Somalia that had remained under insurgent control for nearly a decade. The operation captured international attention as proof that Somalia was finally turning the corner in its fight against extremism. The reality that emerged 3 years later reveals how that apparent success created the exact conditions that enabled Al-Shabaab's 2025 siege of Mogadishu. The offensive began with simultaneous attacks across the Hiran and Middle Shabelle regions, targeting Al-Shabaab strongholds, including Adan Yabal, El Baraf, and Made. Federal forces, supported by local clan militias and African Union troops, launched coordinated assaults involving an estimated 8,000 Somali troops, 3,500 clan militia fighters, and 2,200 African Union soldiers. The operation represented the most ambitious government military campaign since the formation of the current federal system. The strategy that enabled success relied on using elite shock troops to capture territory, while regular forces maintained control. The Danube Special Forces, trained and equipped by the United States, spearheaded the initial assaults. These 850 elite soldiers possessed advanced weapons, night vision equipment, and communication systems that gave them decisive advantages over Al-Shabaab fighters. The plan called for Danube forces to rapidly capture objectives, then withdraw to prepare for the next assault while regular Somali National Army units occupied the captured territory. The Danube Special Forces performed with exceptional effectiveness during the assault phase. The unit successfully captured 23 towns and strategic positions over 6 weeks, following a consistent pattern of pre-dawn assaults supported by intelligence from local clan leaders. Their casualty rate remained remarkably low, with only 12 soldiers killed and 34 wounded across all operations. Their success rate in capturing assigned objectives reached 94%, demonstrating tactical proficiency that matched international special operations standards. United States airstrikes provided crucial support that made the territorial gains possible. American forces conducted 47 airstrikes between August and November 2022, targeting Al-Shabaab leadership, weapons caches, and defensive positions. The strikes eliminated key commanders and destroyed heavy weapons that could have been used against advancing government forces. AFRICOM reported that the airstrikes killed approximately 230 Al-Shabaab fighters and destroyed 18 technical vehicles, 6 weapons storage facilities, and 3 training camps. African Union forces provided essential logistical support and backup firepower during the offensive. ATMIS troops secured supply lines, provided medical evacuation capabilities, and offered heavy weapons support when government forces encountered strong resistance. The Ethiopian and Kenyan contingents within ATMIS were particularly important, as they possessed armored vehicles and artillery systems that Somali forces lacked. This international support created a force multiplication effect that enabled the relatively small number of effective Somali troops to achieve outsized results. The strategy worked perfectly when Somalia maintained the initiative and could concentrate forces for specific objectives. The rapid capture of territory prevented Al-Shabaab from organizing effective counterattacks. The coordination between special forces, regular troops, and international partners created tactical advantages that Al-Shabaab could not match. The offensive demonstrated that the federal government could actually defeat Al-Shabaab when it could mass sufficient forces and maintain operational momentum. However, the transition from offensive to defensive operations exposed fatal vulnerabilities. The vast territories captured during the offensive required permanent garrisons to prevent Al-Shabaab from simply reoccupying abandoned positions. This meant spreading the limited number of effective troops across dozens of locations, diluting their combat effectiveness. The Danube Special Forces, designed for rapid assault operations, found themselves manning static defensive positions in remote outposts. The regular Somali National Army units tasked with holding captured territory proved inadequate for the mission. These forces lacked the training, equipment, and leadership necessary for effective defensive operations. Morale problems became apparent as soldiers found themselves stationed in hostile territory with limited supplies and irregular pay. Desertion rates among regular units reached 35% by mid-2023, forcing commanders to rely increasingly on local clan militias who had their own agendas and loyalty issues. Al-Shabaab used the 2022 to 2024 period to conduct detailed analysis of Somali tactics and develop specific countermeasures. The group studied government assault patterns, identified weaknesses in defensive positions, and developed new tactics designed to exploit these vulnerabilities. Intelligence reports indicate that Al-Shabaab conducted extensive reconnaissance of government positions, mapping defensive layouts, and identifying the most vulnerable outposts. They also studied the rotation schedules of different units, learning when elite forces were present and when positions were held by less capable troops. The insurgent group developed specialized tactics for attacking static defensive positions. They perfected the use of vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices against fortified positions, developed infiltration techniques that exploited gaps in government security, and created diversionary tactics that could draw elite forces away from critical positions. Al-Shabaab also adapted their recruitment and training programs to prepare for the type of warfare they would face against entrenched government forces. The apparent victory of 2022 created strategic overconfidence that blinded Somali leadership to the emerging vulnerabilities. The successful offensive convinced government officials that they had found a winning formula against Al-Shabaab. This led to continued expansion of territorial control without addressing the fundamental problems of force quality, logistics, and defensive capabilities. The government committed increasing numbers of troops to holding territory, while Al-Shabaab concentrated their forces for coordinated assault. By 2025, the government's forces were dispersed across multiple defensive positions, elite units were tied down in static roles, and regular forces were demoralized by the impossible task of holding territory they were not equipped to defend. When Al-Shabaab launched their offensive, they faced exactly the type of dispersed, overstretched enemy that their 3 years of preparation had been designed to defeat. The 2022 success had established the conditions that made Al-Shabaab's breakthrough possible. But the federal government's ability to respond was further compromised by the collapse of the international partnerships that had made that earlier victory achievable. International support system in collapse. The withdrawal of international partners has accelerated dramatically throughout 2024 and 2025, creating security gaps that Al-Shabaab has systematically exploited. The African Union mission in Somalia, which maintained 22,000 troops at its peak, has been replaced by a series of increasingly smaller and less effective missions. The African Transition Mission in Somalia reduced troop levels to 19,626 personnel, but actual deployment consistently fell short as contributing countries became reluctant to commit forces to an increasingly dangerous environment. The current African Union Support and Stabilization Mission in Somalia represents the most dramatic reduction in international support. ASOM was authorized to deploy only 12,626 troops, a 37% reduction from previous mission strength. However, by May 2025, only 4,200 ASOM troops had actually deployed, leaving massive security gaps across the country. The African Union has struggled to find countries willing to contribute troops, with several traditional contributors expressing reluctance to continue their involvement in Somalia operations. Ethiopia's reduced commitment has created the most significant gap in international support. The Ethiopian government faces mounting domestic challenges, including ongoing regional conflicts, economic pressures from inflation and currency devaluation, and political instability that has made foreign military commitments increasingly unpopular. Ethiopia's contribution to ASOM has been reduced to just 2,800 troops compared to the 4,500 they maintained under previous missions. Ethiopian forces have also been repositioned to less active sectors, reducing their effectiveness in countering Al-Shabaab operations. The diplomatic crisis over Somaliland recognition has further strained Ethiopian-Somali military cooperation. Ethiopia's formal recognition of Somaliland independence in March 2025 created tensions that spilled over into security cooperation. The Somali government accused Ethiopia of using the recognition issue to justify reduced commitment to fighting Al-Shabaab, while Ethiopia cited Somalia's hostile diplomatic stance as justification for scaling back military support. American military presence has been dramatically reduced from the levels that enabled Somalia's 2022 success. U.S. Special Operations Forces that provided training and advisory support to Somali units have been reduced from approximately 700 personnel in 2022 to fewer than 200 in 2025. Africa Command has shifted strategic priorities toward the Sahel region and competition with China in East Africa, viewing Somalia as a lower priority compared to other regional challenges. This shift has resulted in reduced intelligence sharing, fewer training programs, and less coordination between American and Somali forces. The reduction in U.S. airstrikes has eliminated crucial fire support that previously enabled government operations. The United States conducted 47 airstrikes in Somalia during 2022, but only 8 during the first half of 2025. The reduction reflects both decreased intelligence capabilities and a shift in targeting priorities toward ISIS Somalia rather than Al-Shabaab. The remaining American presence focuses primarily on counterterrorism operations against international terrorist threats rather than supporting Somali government operations against domestic insurgents. The scheduled withdrawal of international troops has created critical security gaps that replacement forces cannot fill. The withdrawal timeline called for removing thousands of troops throughout 2024 and 2025, but the deployment of replacement forces has lagged significantly behind the withdrawal schedule. This has left key strategic locations without adequate security, allowing Al-Shabaab to reoccupy positions that had been secured during previous government offensives. The most significant gaps have appeared in rural areas where international forces provided the only meaningful security presence. Towns that were secured during the 2022 offensive have been left with minimal security coverage as international forces withdrew faster than Somali forces could assume responsibility. These gaps have provided Al-Shabaab with opportunities to rebuild their networks and prepare for renewed offensive operations. Funding shortfalls have severely hampered remaining international mission effectiveness. The African Union has struggled to secure adequate funding for current operations, with budget shortfalls of approximately $180 million for the mission's first year. The European Union has maintained some funding, but at reduced levels compared to previous operations. The United States has provided limited financial support, focusing primarily on logistics and equipment rather than operational funding. These funding constraints have resulted in reduced operational capabilities for international forces. Troops often lack adequate equipment, vehicles, and ammunition necessary for effective operations. Medical support and evacuation capabilities have been reduced, making deployment more dangerous for contributing countries. Communications equipment and intelligence gathering capabilities have been downgraded due to budget constraints. Competing regional interests have undermined coordinated international response to Somalia's crisis. Kenya and Ethiopia maintain different strategic priorities in Somalia, with Kenya focusing on border security and Ethiopia concerned about regional stability. These competing interests have made it difficult to develop coherent international strategies for addressing Al-Shabaab's resurgence. The African Union has struggled to coordinate between different regional organizations and international partners who maintain different approaches to the Somalia crisis. The bureaucratic delays in establishing new missions and deploying replacement forces have created extended periods without adequate security coverage. The transition between missions involved complex negotiations over mandate, troop levels, and funding that took months to resolve. During these transition periods, Al-Shabaab was able to exploit the uncertainty and reduced international presence to rebuild their capabilities and plan new operations. This systematic withdrawal of international support has left Somalia more vulnerable than at any time since the 1990s. The federal government now faces Al-Shabaab's most sophisticated military campaign with drastically reduced external assistance, creating conditions that would soon enable the insurgent group to achieve what many considered impossible. The stage was set for a single day that would change everything about Somalia's security situation. The February 20th breakthrough. February 20th, 2025 represents the single most significant date in Somalia's security crisis since Al-Shabaab's formation. On this day, the insurgent group launched a coordinated assault across multiple villages in the Hiran and Middle Shabelle regions that fundamentally altered the balance of power in Somalia's ongoing conflict. The operation demonstrated tactical sophistication and strategic planning that caught government forces completely unprepared, marking the beginning of a systematic campaign that would ultimately place Mogadishu under siege. The multi-village assault began at 4:30 a.m. with simultaneous attacks on 7 government positions across a 60-kilometer stretch of the Hiran-Middle Shabelle border region. Al-Shabaab forces, estimated at approximately 800 fighters, struck at El Baraf, Made Adan Yabal, and 4 smaller outposts in a coordinated operation that required months of planning and preparation. The attackers used a combination of vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, mortar barrages, and direct infantry assaults to overwhelm government defenders who had no advance warning of the impending operation. The strategic targeting of the Hiran-Middle Shabelle border region was carefully calculated to achieve maximum impact. This area represents the critical link between Al-Shabaab's historical strongholds in southern Somalia and their operational networks in central regions. The towns targeted during the February 20th assault served as key government staging areas for operations against Al-Shabaab positions. More importantly, these locations controlled road networks and supply lines that the federal government relied upon to maintain communication between Mogadishu and outlying regions. The border region's strategic significance extends beyond its immediate tactical value. Control of this area allows Al-Shabaab to connect previously isolated territorial holdings, creating a continuous zone of influence that stretches from the outskirts of Mogadishu to their strongholds in the south. The capture of these positions also provided Al-Shabaab with access to major transportation routes that facilitate the movement of fighters, weapons, and supplies between different operational areas. Initial government claims of victory following the February 20th assault painted a picture of successful defense against Al-Shabaab attacks. The Somali Ministry of Information issued statements claiming that government forces had killed 130 Al-Shabaab fighters while suffering only minimal casualties themselves. These reports described fierce fighting in which Somali troops had successfully repelled coordinated attacks across multiple locations. The government's narrative suggested that Al-Shabaab had launched desperate attacks that failed to achieve their objectives. Official statements from the Somali National Army described the engagement as a significant victory that demonstrated the improving capabilities of government forces. Military spokesmen claimed that Al-Shabaab had attempted to capture strategic positions but had been forced to retreat after suffering heavy casualties. The government's initial reporting emphasized the effectiveness of their defensive preparations and the heroic resistance of Somali soldiers who had prevented Al-Shabaab from achieving their goals. U.S. airstrikes conducted in the immediate aftermath of the February 20th assault initially appeared to support the government's success narrative. American forces launched 3 airstrikes targeting Al-Shabaab positions in the region, reportedly killing an additional 25 fighters and destroying several vehicles. AFRICOM statements described these strikes as supporting Somali government operations against terrorist forces. The timing and location of these airstrikes seemed to confirm that government forces maintained control of the contested areas. The evidence that emerged over the following weeks completely contradicted the official government narrative. Satellite imagery analysis revealed that Al-Shabaab fighters had actually occupied the towns they had attacked, establishing defensive positions and raising their flags over government buildings. Videos released by Al-Shabaab's media wing showed fighters conducting patrols through the captured towns, displaying captured government weapons and equipment. These images proved that the group had achieved their operational objectives despite official claims to the contrary. Intelligence reports indicated that Al-Shabaab had captured significant quantities of military equipment during the February 20th operation. The group seized at least 12 military vehicles, substantial amounts of small arms ammunition, communications equipment, and supplies that had been stockpiled at government positions. More significantly, they captured detailed intelligence materials including operational plans, troop deployment information, and communications protocols that would prove valuable for future operations. The psychological impact of this deception on Somali military morale proved devastating. Soldiers who had been told they were winning discovered that their commanders had been lying about the actual results of the fighting. The realization that official reports bore no relationship to battlefield reality created widespread cynicism among government forces. Troops began questioning the reliability of their leadership and the accuracy of intelligence they received about Al-Shabaab capabilities and intentions. Al-Shabaab's information warfare capabilities demonstrated sophisticated understanding of modern propaganda techniques. The group released professionally produced videos documenting their territorial gains, complete with interviews of local residents who described government forces fleeing without resistance. These materials contrasted sharply with government claims of successful defense, creating cognitive dissonance that undermined public confidence in official reporting. The February 20th breakthrough marked the beginning of a systematic campaign designed to encircle Mogadishu through the capture of strategically important positions. The operation served as a proof of concept for Al-Shabaab's new tactical approach, demonstrating that government forces could not effectively defend multiple positions simultaneously. The success of this initial assault provided the group with confidence and momentum that would drive subsequent operations throughout 2025, creating conditions that would soon trigger a cascade. The domino effect accelerates. Al-Shabaab's tactical success began generating unstoppable momentum that would fundamentally reshape Somalia's security landscape. The psychological shift that followed their February breakthrough created a self-reinforcing cycle where each victory made the next one more likely, as demoralized troops abandoned positions and terrified civilians withdrew their support from government forces. This realization spread through Somalia's military structure like wildfire, triggering defensive collapses that no amount of government propaganda could conceal. The systematic capture of bridges and connecting infrastructure revealed Al-Shabaab's sophisticated understanding of Somalia's geography and transportation networks. The group prioritized seizing control points that linked their previously fragmented territorial holdings, creating continuous corridors of influence that stretched across southern Somalia. Key bridges over seasonal rivers became primary targets, as their capture effectively cut government supply lines while enabling Al-Shabaab to move fighters and equipment between different operational areas. The Shab Bell River crossings proved particularly valuable, as controlling these choke points allowed Al-Shabaab to regulate all north-south movement in the region. The March 11th hotel bombing in Mogadishu struck at the heart of Somalia's military coordination efforts, targeting a facility where senior commanders had gathered to plan responses to Al-Shabaab's territorial advances. The attack killed 8 military officials and wounded 23 others, including several colonel-level officers responsible for coordinating operations in the regions where Al-Shabaab had achieved their breakthrough. The bombing demonstrated Al-Shabaab's intelligence capabilities within the capital, showing they could identify and target specific individuals crucial to government military planning. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate casualties, as surviving commanders realized that even supposedly secure locations in Mogadishu were vulnerable to attack. The near assassination of Somalia's president on March 15th brought the conflict directly to the highest levels of government leadership. The attack involved a sophisticated car bomb positioned along the president's motorcade route, detonating just 200 meters from the presidential vehicle. 3 security personnel were killed and 12 injured in the blast, which occurred despite extensive security precautions that included route changes and decoy vehicles. The incident forced the president to cancel public appearances and limit movement outside the heavily fortified presidential compound, effectively isolating the country's leadership from a population they claimed to represent. The April mortar attack on the presidential palace represented a dramatic escalation in Al-Shabaab's ability to project power into the heart of Mogadishu. The attack involved a coordinated barrage of 12 mortar rounds that struck the palace compound, causing structural damage to several buildings and forcing staff to evacuate to underground shelters. The precision of the attack suggested that Al-Shabaab had conducted detailed reconnaissance of the palace layout and had positioned their mortars at carefully calculated distances. The fact that the group could conduct such an operation in Somalia's most heavily defended location sent a clear message about their operational capabilities. Nighttime patrols by Al-Shabaab fighters began appearing throughout territories the group had recently captured, establishing visible symbols of their territorial control. These patrols served multiple purposes beyond simple security, acting as recruitment tools that demonstrated the group's strength to potential supporters while intimidating government sympathizers. The patrols followed predictable routes and schedules, showing local populations that Al-Shabaab maintained permanent presence rather than conducting hit-and-run operations. Intelligence reports indicated that these patrols were coordinated across multiple locations, suggesting centralized command and control over expanded territorial holdings. Captured weapons and equipment from retreating government forces significantly strengthened Al-Shabaab's military capabilities. Each government position that fell provided the insurgents with additional small arms, ammunition, communications equipment, and vehicles that enhanced their ability to conduct subsequent operations. The most significant captures included armored vehicles, heavy machine guns, and military-grade communications systems that allowed for better coordination between different Al-Shabaab units. Intelligence estimates suggest that Al-Shabaab captured equipment worth approximately $2.3 million during the March and April operations, representing a substantial upgrade to their military capabilities. The captured equipment also included sensitive intelligence materials that provided Al-Shabaab with detailed information about government military plans, troop positions, and operational procedures. These materials enabled the group to anticipate government responses and position their forces accordingly. The intelligence windfall from captured positions gave Al-Shabaab significant advantages in planning subsequent operations, as they could predict government tactics and identify vulnerabilities in defensive positions. The mild rainy season that began in April failed to slow Al-Shabaab's mobility as government planners had expected. Somali military leaders had anticipated that seasonal rains would make road movement difficult and provide them with time to reorganize their defenses. However, the 2025 rainy season proved unusually light, with precipitation levels approximately 40% below historical averages. This allowed Al-Shabaab to maintain their operational tempo throughout a period when they would normally have been forced to reduce activity levels. Each Al-Shabaab victory attracted new recruits and local support from communities that had previously remained neutral in the conflict. The group's success demonstrated their ability to provide security and governance in areas where the federal government had failed, leading to increased cooperation from local populations. Village elders who had previously cooperated with government forces began negotiating agreements with Al-Shabaab representatives, seeking to avoid the violent confrontations that had characterized other areas. The recruitment surge provided Al-Shabaab with additional manpower that enabled them to garrison captured territories while maintaining offensive capabilities. Local fighters familiar with specific regions proved particularly valuable, as they possessed detailed knowledge of terrain, population centers, and government defensive positions. This domino effect created conditions that would soon test Somalia's most capable military units in ways they had never experienced before. Elite forces crumble under pressure. The Danube Special Forces, Somalia's most elite military unit, have collapsed under the sustained pressure of Al-Shabaab's coordinated campaign. These soldiers, trained by American advisors and equipped with advanced weapon systems, were specifically designed to serve as Somalia's answer to insurgent threats. The unit had demonstrated exceptional effectiveness during the 2022 offensive, successfully capturing strategic positions that regular forces could not approach. The reality that has emerged during 2025 shows that even these elite formations cannot sustain operations against Al-Shabaab's evolved tactics. The April 9th assassination of Lieutenant Colonel Ahmed Hassan Mohamud, commander of the Danube Special Forces, marked a turning point that extends far beyond the loss of a single officer. Mohamud had led the unit since 2021 and was personally responsible for many of the tactical innovations that made the 2022 offensive successful. His killing occurred during what should have been a routine patrol in the Hiran region when Al-Shabaab fighters ambushed his convoy using sophisticated intelligence about his movement patterns. The attack demonstrated that Al-Shabaab had developed detailed knowledge of elite unit operations and could target specific leadership figures with precision. The symbolic significance of Mohammed's death cannot be overstated within Somalia's military hierarchy. He represented the new generation of professional officers who had been trained to international standards and possessed the tactical knowledge necessary to fight Al-Shabaab effectively. His assassination sent a clear message that no government military leader was safe from Al-Shabaab's reach, regardless of their security precautions or elite status. The psychological impact on other Special Forces commanders was immediate, with several requesting transfers to less exposed positions or taking extended leave for security reasons. The disappearance of hundreds of police officers represents another catastrophic failure of Somalia's security institutions. Intelligence reports indicate that approximately 840 police officers have gone missing since February 2025, with many suspected of defecting to Al-Shabaab rather than facing certain death in hopeless defensive positions. The Somali police force had been considered more reliable than regular army units due to their local recruitment and better pay structure, making their mass defection particularly damaging to government morale. The pattern of police defections began in areas where Al-Shabaab had achieved territorial control, with officers abandoning their posts rather than attempting to resist superior enemy forces. However, the defections spread to areas that remained under government control, indicating that the problem extended beyond immediate tactical circumstances. Former police officers who defected reported that they had lost confidence in the government's ability to protect them or their families, viewing Al-Shabaab as the more powerful and reliable force. Elite units achieved numerous tactical successes that demonstrated their individual capabilities, but could not sustain these gains without adequate support from regular forces. The Danube Special Forces successfully conducted 23 raids against Al-Shabaab positions between March and May 2025, killing an estimated 180 insurgent fighters and capturing substantial quantities of weapons and equipment. These operations showed that Somalia's elite forces retained their tactical edge and could defeat Al-Shabaab fighters in direct confrontations. However, these tactical victories proved meaningless because regular Somali forces could not hold the positions that elite units had captured. The pattern repeated across multiple operations where special forces would successfully assault Al-Shabaab positions only to watch insurgent fighters reoccupy the same areas within days or weeks. The inability to convert tactical success into strategic gains demoralized elite units and demonstrated the fundamental weakness of Somalia's military structure. The impossible position of shock troops attempting to defend multiple fronts simultaneously has stretched Somalia's elite forces beyond their operational capabilities. The Danube Special Forces, designed as a mobile assault unit, found themselves required to maintain static defensive positions across dozens of locations. This deployment pattern violated fundamental principles of special operations, which emphasize concentration of force and rapid mobility rather than dispersed defensive operations. High desertion rates have reached crisis levels even among Somalia's most capable units, with the Danube Special Forces experiencing a 28% desertion rate since January 2025. These rates represent a dramatic increase from the 8% desertion rate recorded in 2023, indicating that even elite forces are losing confidence in their mission and leadership. The desertion problem has been compounded by the fact that many of the soldiers leaving are experienced veterans whose departure severely impacts unit effectiveness. Threats against deserters' families have backfired spectacularly, worsening rather than improving morale among government forces. Military commanders began implementing policies that held soldiers' families responsible for desertion, threatening to withhold pay or pursue legal action against relatives of soldiers who abandoned their posts. These policies created additional stress for soldiers who were already facing life-threatening situations, as they now had to worry about their family's safety regardless of their own decisions. Al-Shabaab's diversionary tactics have systematically stretched elite forces beyond their capabilities by creating multiple simultaneous threats that require immediate response. The insurgent group has perfected the art of conducting small-scale attacks across multiple locations, forcing government commanders to deploy their limited elite forces to address each threat. This strategy prevents the concentration of force that would be necessary to achieve decisive results against Al-Shabaab's main positions. The psychological warfare campaign has broken the will of previously effective units through a combination of targeted assassinations, propaganda operations, and strategic deception. Al-Shabaab has demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military psychology, conducting operations specifically designed to demoralize government forces rather than simply inflict casualties. The collapse of elite forces has left the government's most critical strategic positions vulnerable to coordinated assault, creating opportunities that Al-Shabaab has been systematically preparing to exploit. The siege tightens around Mogadishu. By May 2025, Al-Shabaab had transformed these tactical victories into a methodical encirclement of Mogadishu that demonstrates military strategy executed with precision rivaling conventional armies. The insurgent group has systematically captured positions that form an increasingly tight noose around Somalia's capital, following a deliberate pattern of territorial acquisition that eliminates government escape routes while establishing insurgent control over critical infrastructure. Each captured position serves a specific purpose in the broader campaign to isolate Mogadishu from the rest of the country, creating conditions where the federal government cannot receive supplies, reinforcements, or intelligence from outside sources. The April 16th capture of Adan Yabal marked the most significant milestone in Al-Shabaab's siege campaign, as this town had served as the primary government's staging area for operations throughout the central regions. Adanyabal's strategic importance extends beyond its size or population, functioning as a critical logistics hub where government forces stockpile weapons, ammunition, and supplies for distribution to outlying positions. The town's location at the intersection of three major roads made it essential for coordinating military movements between Mogadishu and the territories that government forces had captured during the 2022 offensive. The government had invested heavily in fortifying Adanyabal, constructing defensive positions that included concrete barriers, watchtowers, and underground bunkers designed to withstand sustained assault. The position housed approximately 800 government soldiers and 1,200 clan militia fighters, supported by armored vehicles and heavy weapons that represented some of the federal government's most advanced military equipment. Intelligence reports indicated that the government viewed Adanyabal as impregnable, with military commanders confident that the fortified position could withstand any assault that Al-Shabaab might mount. The battle for Adanyabal demonstrated Al-Shabaab's tactical evolution in the most dramatic terms possible, as approximately 100 insurgent fighters reportedly routed 2,500 government troops and militia through superior planning and execution. The assault began at 3:45 a.m. with coordinated mortar strikes that targeted the government's command center and communications equipment, effectively blinding the defenders and preventing them from coordinating their response. Vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices breached the perimeter defenses at three separate points, creating gaps that allowed Al-Shabaab fighters to enter the compound. The government forces' collapse at Adanyabal revealed fundamental problems with morale and leadership that extended far beyond simple tactical considerations. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority and defensive advantages, government troops abandoned their positions within 6 hours of the initial assault. Many soldiers fled without engaging Al-Shabaab fighters, leaving behind weapons, ammunition, and equipment that significantly enhanced the insurgent group's capabilities. The rapid collapse suggested that government forces lacked the will to fight even under favorable conditions. The simultaneous capture of a Bur village occurred just 12 kilometers from Adanyabal, demonstrating Al-Shabaab's ability to coordinate complex operations across multiple locations. Bur's strategic value lay in its position along the main supply route connecting Mogadishu to government positions in the north, making it a critical choke point for military logistics. The village's capture effectively cut the primary road network that government forces relied upon for resupply and reinforcement operations. Al-Shabaab's assault on Bur involved approximately 60 fighters who overwhelmed the 200-man government garrison through tactics that emphasized speed and psychological pressure. The attackers used loudspeakers to broadcast surrender demands while conducting precision strikes against defensive positions. The psychological warfare component proved particularly effective, as many government soldiers surrendered rather than attempting to fight. The rapid collapse of Bur's defenses provided Al-Shabaab with additional evidence that government forces could not sustain resistance under pressure. The loss of these positions consolidated Al-Shabaab's territorial gains by reconnecting previously isolated insurgent holdings into a continuous zone of control. The capture of Adanyabal and Bur created a territorial corridor that stretched from Al-Shabaab's traditional strongholds in the south to their newly acquired positions around Mogadishu. This territorial continuity allows the group to move fighters, weapons, and supplies freely between different operational areas without encountering government checkpoints or defensive positions. Airstrikes conducted in response to Al-Shabaab's territorial gains proved completely ineffective at dislodging insurgent forces from their captured positions. The United States launched 7 airstrikes against Al-Shabaab positions in the Adanyabal area between April 17th and April 25th, reportedly killing 34 insurgent fighters and destroying several vehicles. However, these strikes failed to weaken Al-Shabaab's control over the captured territory or force them to withdraw from their new positions. The ineffectiveness of air strikes reflects Al-Shabaab's tactical adaptations that minimize their vulnerability to aerial attack. The group has developed sophisticated camouflage techniques and dispersal patterns that make them difficult to target from the air. They have also learned to use civilian populations and infrastructure as shields, making precision strikes extremely difficult without causing collateral damage. Al-Shabaab has used the May lull in major operations to strengthen their defensive positions and prepare for the next phase of their campaign. Intelligence reports indicate that the group has been constructing fortified positions around captured towns, digging trenches and bunkers that would allow them to resist government counterattacks. They have also been moving additional fighters and equipment into the region, suggesting preparation for expanded operations. The complete encirclement of Mogadishu has been achieved through systematic capture of positions that control all major supply routes leading to the capital. Al-Shabaab now controls the roads connecting Mogadishu to the north, west, and south, effectively cutting the city off from external support. The only remaining connection to the outside world is through Mogadishu's port and airport, both of which remain vulnerable to insurgent attack. With the siege complete, Al-Shabaab has begun implementing a different kind of warfare designed terror campaign inside the capital. The insurgent group has launched a systematic terror campaign targeting both government forces and civilian populations within the capital itself. This strategic transition represents a calculated escalation that exploits territorial gains to project power directly into Somalia's political and military establishment. Rather than attempting immediate military occupation of the entire city, Al-Shabaab has adopted an approach that uses terror attacks to demonstrate their capability to strike anywhere within Mogadishu while gradually eroding the psychological foundations of government resistance. The suicide bombing at the Army Recruitment Center on May 14th killed 10 people and wounded 23 others, sending a clear message about Al-Shabaab's operational priorities within the capital. The attack targeted young Somalis attempting to join government forces, representing both a tactical blow against military recruitment and a symbolic statement about the futility of opposing Al-Shabaab's advance. The bomber, identified as a 19-year-old man from the Bakul region, had infiltrated the recruitment process and detonated his explosive vest during a medical examination session in a crowded hall. The strategic messaging embedded in the recruitment center attack extends beyond casualty figures to encompass broader themes of government vulnerability and Al-Shabaab's reach. The group selected a target that represented hope for Somalia's future, as the recruitment center symbolized young people's willingness to serve their country against extremist forces. By destroying this symbol through a suicide attack, Al-Shabaab demonstrated that they could penetrate government security measures and strike at the foundation of state military power. The attack also served as a warning to other potential recruits that joining government forces would make them targets for elimination. Mortar attacks have become routine occurrences throughout Mogadishu, with Al-Shabaab conducting systematic bombardments that target government facilities, military installations, and civilian areas with strategic value. The group has launched 47 mortar attacks since April 1st, with strikes occurring at an average rate of one every 2.3 days. These attacks demonstrate Al-Shabaab's ability to position artillery systems within range of critical targets while avoiding detection by government security forces. The consistent pattern of mortar strikes has created a climate of fear and uncertainty that affects both military operations and civilian daily life. The mortar campaign follows a deliberate pattern that maximizes psychological impact while minimizing Al-Shabaab's exposure to counterattack. The group typically conducts strikes during peak activity periods when government facilities are most crowded, ensuring maximum casualties and media attention. They use multiple firing positions to prevent government forces from targeting their artillery, often firing from residential areas where counterattacks would cause civilian casualties. The timing and targeting of these attacks suggests sophisticated intelligence gathering capabilities that allow Al-Shabaab to monitor government activities and select optimal moments for maximum impact. Al-Shabaab's infiltration capabilities have enabled them to strike high-value targets throughout Mogadishu, demonstrating that no location within the capital is beyond their operational reach. The group has successfully conducted attacks against the presidential palace, military headquarters, government ministries, and international facilities despite extensive security measures protecting these locations. These operations require detailed knowledge of security protocols, building layouts, and personnel movements that can only be obtained through extensive intelligence networks operating within the capital. The infiltration network that enables these attacks appears to include government employees, security personnel, and civilian contractors who provide Al-Shabaab with real-time intelligence about target vulnerabilities. The group has demonstrated knowledge of meeting schedules, security rotations, and defensive preparations that indicates access to information from within government institutions. This internal intelligence capability gives Al-Shabaab significant advantages in planning and executing attacks against supposedly secure facilities. The group has demonstrated their ability to threaten government buildings and leadership through increasingly sophisticated attacks that have forced officials to modify their security procedures and limit their public activities. The April mortar attack on the presidential palace forced the evacuation of senior government officials to underground bunkers, while the March assassination attempt against the president required substantial changes to his security protocols. These attacks have effectively isolated Somalia's leadership from a population they claim to represent, undermining the government's ability to maintain public confidence and support. Al-Shabaab's terror campaign has been specifically designed to break civilian morale and government will through systematic psychological pressure that exploits the siege conditions surrounding Mogadishu. The group's attacks target locations that civilians frequent, including markets, transportation hubs, and religious facilities, creating an atmosphere where ordinary activities become dangerous. This psychological pressure is intended to convince civilians that the government cannot protect them, leading to decreased cooperation with security forces and increased sympathy for Al-Shabaab's position. Innovation in bomb-making and delivery systems has enabled Al-Shabaab to conduct increasingly sophisticated attacks that defeat government security measures. The group has developed vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices that can penetrate concrete barriers and reinforced structures, suicide vests that can evade metal detectors and security screening, and remote-controlled devices that can be activated from safe distances. These technological advances reflect Al-Shabaab's access to international expertise and their commitment to maintaining tactical advantages over government forces. The siege conditions surrounding Mogadishu amplify the psychological impact of each attack by creating a sense of isolation and helplessness among both government forces and civilian populations. The knowledge that no external assistance can reach the capital creates additional psychological pressure that magnifies the impact of each terrorist incident. Every attack reinforces the message that Al-Shabaab controls the strategic initiative and can strike at will, while government forces remain reactive and defensive. These terror tactics are preparing the ground for a potential final assault by systematically weakening government resistance capabilities and civilian support for continued fighting. As Somalia's crisis deepens and the siege tightens, the international community faces increasingly difficult questions about whether external intervention remains possible or if the moment for effective action has already passed. The world's inadequate response. International partners have responded to this escalating crisis with measures that fall drastically short of what the situation demands. The magnitude of Al-Shabaab's territorial gains and the speed of their advance toward Mogadishu has forced the global community to confront an uncomfortable reality. Limited engagement and gradual support measures cannot address a crisis of this scale. The choice now appears to be between massive military commitment comparable to previous interventions in Afghanistan or Iraq, or accepting that Somalia will become the world's first nation-state to fall completely under al-Qaeda affiliate control since the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan. Turkey's announcement to triple its deployment to 800 soldiers, including 300 commandos, represents the most significant international military response to Al-Shabaab's offensive, but the scale of this commitment reveals the inadequacy of current international engagement. The Turkish deployment, scheduled to be completed by July 2025, will include special operations forces trained in counterterrorism and urban warfare, along with additional training personnel and logistics support. However, 800 soldiers represents a fraction of the force levels that military analysts believe would be necessary to reverse Al-Shabaab's territorial gains and restore government control over southern Somalia. The Turkish commitment also reflects the limited appetite among international partners for substantial military engagement in Somalia. Turkey's willingness to increase its deployment stems from specific strategic interests, including protection of Turkish investments in Somalia and maintaining influence in the Horn of Africa region. Other international partners have shown reluctance to match Turkey's commitment, with most limiting their responses to diplomatic statements and humanitarian aid rather than military support that could meaningfully impact the security situation. International forces operating in Somalia face escalating risks that demonstrate the dangers of intervention in the current security environment. The mortar attack that killed 3 Americans on May 8th occurred at a logistics facility near Mogadishu International Airport, showing that Al-Shabaab can target international personnel even in supposedly secure areas. The attack involved a coordinated barrage of 8 mortar rounds that struck a compound housing American contractors working on security assistance programs. The precision of the attack suggested detailed intelligence about the facility's layout and the presence of American personnel. The American casualties represent the highest single-day losses for U.S. personnel in Somalia since the 2017 attack that killed 1 soldier, demonstrating the deteriorating security environment for international forces. The incident forced the evacuation of non-essential American personnel from Somalia and led to enhanced security protocols that limit the effectiveness of remaining advisory missions. The attack also highlighted the vulnerability of international personnel to Al-Shabaab's indirect fire capabilities, which can strike targets throughout the Mogadishu area. Ethiopian and Kenyan casualties have mounted steadily throughout 2025, with Ethiopian forces losing 23 soldiers and Kenyan forces losing 18 soldiers in various engagements with Al-Shabaab fighters. These losses occurred despite the fact that both countries maintain some of the most experienced forces in Somalia, with troops who have been deployed to the country for over a decade. The Ethiopian casualties included 11 soldiers killed in a single ambush in March, while Kenyan losses have been spread across multiple smaller engagements and improvised explosive device attacks. The casualties among experienced African Union forces demonstrate that even seasoned troops familiar with Somalia's operating environment face significant risks from Al-Shabaab's evolved tactics. The losses have contributed to domestic political pressure in both Ethiopia and Kenya to reduce their commitments to Somalia operations, complicating efforts to maintain international force levels necessary for effective intervention. The shift in U.S. airstrikes from ISIS targets to Al-Shabaab positions reflects recognition that Al-Shabaab has become the primary threat to Somali stability, but the scale of air operations remains insufficient to meaningfully impact the group's territorial control. American forces conducted 12 airstrikes against Al-Shabaab positions in May 2025, compared to just 3 strikes against ISIS Somalia targets. However, these strikes have failed to slow Al-Shabaab's advance or force them to abandon captured territories, suggesting that air power alone cannot address the crisis. The limited effectiveness of airstrikes reflects Al-Shabaab's tactical adaptations that minimize their vulnerability to aerial attack. The group has developed sophisticated camouflage and dispersal techniques that make them difficult to target from the air, while their use of civilian areas as operating bases complicates precision strikes. The political constraints on airstrikes in populated areas have further limited their effectiveness as a tool for reversing Al-Shabaab's territorial gains. The international community faces a fundamental choice between massive military commitment or gradual withdrawal from Somalia, with limited middle ground options remaining viable. Military analysts estimate that reversing Al-Shabaab's territorial gains would require a force of at least 50,000 international troops, comparable to the initial deployments in Afghanistan or Iraq. Such a commitment would require sustained political will and financial resources that no single country or international organization has demonstrated willingness to provide. The comparison to America's situation in Kabul in 2021 has become increasingly relevant as Al-Shabaab consolidates control around Mogadishu. Like the Taliban's final offensive in Afghanistan, Al-Shabaab's campaign has demonstrated the ineffectiveness of limited international support when facing a determined insurgent force with popular support and territorial control. The lessons learned from Afghanistan suggest that without massive international commitment, Somalia's government will likely collapse in a similar manner to the Afghan government's rapid defeat. The reluctance of major powers to lead comprehensive intervention efforts reflects broader strategic priorities and lessons learned from previous interventions. The United States has shifted focus toward great power competition with China and Russia, viewing Somalia as a lower strategic priority compared to other regions. European nations remain focused on security challenges closer to home, while regional powers lack the resources necessary for large-scale intervention in Somalia. This inadequate response has created a dangerous vacuum that Al-Shabaab continues to exploit with devastating effectiveness. The consequences of international inaction are becoming increasingly clear as Somalia approaches what may be its most critical moment since the collapse of the central government in the 1990s. The window for preventing this catastrophe may have already closed. Somalia faces its worst crisis since the 1990s, with Al-Shabaab positioned to control the entire country for the first time in the nation's history. The group's systematic siege of Mogadishu represents the potential collapse of the last functioning government institution in East Africa's most strategically important failed state. Al-Shabaab's victory would create a terrorist-controlled territory larger than most European nations, providing Al-Qaeda affiliates with ports, airports, and territorial bases that could destabilize the entire Horn of Africa region. The question now is whether the international community will mobilize the massive military commitment necessary to prevent this outcome, or watch another state fall completely